All right, Lev, the floor is yours for session number 3.
Hey, Brian, thank you. Good to be back. So yeah, this is session number 3 for the life strategy sessions. It's a hard word to say. So in the first session, we looked at how to attract and build a loyal webinar audience. Then we looked at how to gain control over the buyer journey and the content journey with webinars. Now we're going to go really deep into the 3 core foundations of webinar success at scale. So we're looking at thinking big in this session. We're not thinking about 30 webinars, 50 webinars a year. We're talking about hundreds, potentially thousands of webinars, potentially multiple webinar programs in parallel, maybe even ranging up to creating webinar service desks that combine all the programs. We won't have time to go into webinar service desks in the session, but if you're interested in talking about that, hit me up on LinkedIn and then we can do that and geek out over those kind of things. But here we're going to look at some instructional ways of in making sure that your webinars at scale can succeed as well. So with that in mind, the key principle, really, not the core foundation, but a key principle behind all of this is sustainability. So sustainability really is the prerequisite for webinar success at scale. So as we go through these next few slides, bear that in mind. If it's not sustainable, you will not succeed with webinar success at scale. And we'll go into the first core foundation, which is processes. And probably hear a bit of groaning on that one. I geek out on this kind of stuff. We love this kind of stuff here at Webinar Experts. Processes make our lives easier. They may be painful to create and set up, but you will reap the rewards from doing them well. And ultimately, that will allow you to scale up your webinar programs into the numbers that we just spoke about. So we're going to go into this a little bit, and it's bear with me because I know not everybody likes processes, but it's very important for this topic. So your processes must be a couple of different things. First of all, they must be fully detailed and documented. So when you think about your overall webinar process, that might take you some time. And it might be that you have to do this multiple times over the coming months and maybe periodically every year. But you need to look at your entire process, write it down in detail. And the best way to do that is really to start big. So what are the 3 core areas maybe, and then break it down further after that. So you want to be looking at maybe starting with planning, setup, and execution. And there may be 3 or 4 different areas maybe on top of that, but as a core starting point, that might be good. And then start breaking those down into smaller sub-processes, and then below that, individual steps below that as well, and start detailing all that out. And then you need to document it. And when I say document, there's different ways of doing this. We'll talk about this in a moment. There's different tools you can do it with. So it's not just a case of creating a Word document, and certainly don't create something and put it on OneDrive where it'll die a death. You need to be documenting this so it becomes a working thing. And then ultimately you need to look at visualizing this and communicating it. There's no point creating a process and detailing all of that and then not communicating and not visualizing it to others. You and maybe your team, you will have spent some time creating this process and you are intimately familiar with it, but other contributors, especially as you scale up, will not be. They will have other day jobs to do. They will need to look at do different things, and they will contribute from time to time to your webinar program, but they will not know the details. So you need to visualize it in a way that is easy to understand, easy to see the vision behind it, the purpose behind it, and you need to communicate that really well and probably communicate that repeatedly over time. And then the third point is it needs to be contributor friendly. As you look at scaling webinars into the hundreds, maybe more, you will have a lot more contributors to the program, to the individual webinars, because without more contributors, you won't be able to scale. And that contribution needs to be really easy. If you make it complicated or difficult to understand, or people can't visualize it, then that contribution becomes more labored, becomes more manual, and ultimately it will not happen. You will not get the contribution that you need in order to scale up. So make it really user-friendly, make it easy for people to interact with you and contribute to that overall process. And then these process steps and these processes need to be accountable. And what I mean by that is you need to be able to say, has this process or this process step been fulfilled? Has it been completed in the way that we need it to be? So it's not about holding people accountable. You haven't done this. That's not what it's about. This is more for you to be able to check, has this been done? Can we move on to the next phase? And so that accountability needs to be there, because it's fine to do this on a webinar a week, and you can manually check it. As you scale this out and you're looking at maybe 5, 10, 20 webinars a week or a month, you need to be able to check that more easily, and those checks need to be in place. And then these processes need to be integrated, both in terms of marketing as well as technology. So what I mean by that is integration with marketing. Your webinar program at scale cannot sit in a silo. It cannot just exist by itself. It relies on many more people to, like I say, contribute to it, to work within it. And the program itself needs to then also exist within your marketing strategy, within your marketing ecosystem, and all of that needs to work and be integrated with each other so that it forms a cohesive part of what the company is doing. And technology-wise also, so on a very basic level, it needs to be integrated at minimum with your marketing automation tool and your CRM system and your webinar tool itself. So you have this continuous flow between the three, where the marketing automation tool feeds registration into the webinar tool. The webinar tool will then feed data into the CRM tool, and the CRM tool informs the marketing automation tool ultimately in terms of who is the marketable database for this. So your processes need to be part of that ecosystem, that integration. And then we need to look at automating as much as possible. As we scale webinar programs, again, like I say, into the hundreds, maybe into the thousands, if every single process step for each webinar is manual, it becomes very labor intensive. And the only way to get on top of that as you scale is to throw more manpower at it and be able to manually do this. And that is not sustainable. Going back to the original point I made, everything that we do here needs to be sustainable. So try and automate steps. And the best way to approach this is look at your process, identify the areas that are most labor intensive, but that are the easiest to automate. And that may be between different systems, that may be other process steps that can be automated, either using technology that you have in-house already, and maybe through APIs, maybe through third-party automation software, but ultimately try and automate as much as possible and start with the ones that are the most labor-intensive, but the easiest to automate, and then make your way down through the list to see what else can we automate, and that will make your life easier on your journey towards scaling up. And then it needs to be smart. The process needs to be smart, and what I mean by that is there needs to be redundancy, and it needs to support multiple formats. And with redundancy, I mean there has to be checks along the way as you go through the process. You know, and this process may include 80, maybe 100, maybe more individual process steps, and you need to be able to check, has something been done, and if not, how do we replace that step or fulfill that step if it hasn't been done before at the right time. So there has to be that check along the way, that you can't just progress from step 1 to step 100. Without any checks in between. That has to be visualized somehow, and we'll talk about how that can be done in a moment. And I suppose on the multi-format as well, we heard before in my previous session, we heard it in a few other sessions as well, that there are potentially 7, 8, maybe more different webinar formats that you might be running, and the process itself cannot be as rigid as only to support 1 or 2 webinar formats. Or maybe as you develop over time, you may create more webinar formats that have different requirements, and the process has to allow you to do that. You cannot create multiple processes for multiple webinar formats. That simply isn't scalable. And again, it comes back to that core principle of sustainability. So create a process, and like I said, this might take a little bit of time, but you will need to create something that is flexible enough and nimble enough to allow you to run multiple webinar formats within the same process. So the way you describe the process steps and the way you arrange the process itself has to allow for that as well. And then there's various areas that your processes must cover as well. And this is maybe sort of a slightly instructional list of things that you need to consider as you go through defining your process, but it needs to cover your planning. So as you, again, use the example of maybe 30 webinars a year. That is easy to plan, and you can do that on an Excel sheet or whatever it might be. But as you go into planning across perhaps a matrix organization, multiple languages, multiple business divisions, going into these hundreds of webinars, your planning needs to be a bit smarter, and it needs to follow a process. And ultimately that comes down to sustainability again, the consistency as well, to say this is how we do things, this is how we plan things, it follows a process, and that is repeatable. Without that, there simply won't be any scale. And then it needs to also cover scheduling. The same principles as with planning. You will need to schedule, you will need to look at when are things happening. You need to, there's only so far you can plan ahead and schedule ahead, We're looking maybe at 1 or 2 quarters maximum. But ultimately, the scheduling process needs to be covered or needs to be created. So how do we schedule? What are the principles behind our scheduling strategy? How are we dividing this up between business divisions, between languages, between webinar formats? And there has to be a process behind that. It can be simple, it may be more complicated, it depends entirely on your organization, but there has to be a process in place. And the same then also applies to preparation. So preparing for each individual webinar, or perhaps a webinar series, or preparing the program as it moves into the next year, for example. There may be a change in messaging. All that preparation that goes into that, again, needs to follow a process. And it's likely that that will not change significantly quarter on quarter, year on year, but over time that will evolve, and you need to make sure that the process does cover your preparation mechanism, so that you have that laid out and you can work against that without having to reinvent the wheel. And then we get to the webinar setup itself, and again, you may find that your team changes. You maybe have new hires, you may have people leaving. There may be that bit of brain drain where people just take knowledge with them, and the new hire hasn't had a proper handover from the previous person, and they just set up things differently. And it might be less efficient than you may have laid out if you had a process. So make sure that the setup, again, follows a process, and that will become second nature how you do it, but at least it's documented and it is available to check against as and when needed. And then we look at the promotion, and this is likely where you will work with a different team, your marketing operations team, your email team, perhaps social media, and so on as well. And again, there has to be a process on how are we at scale providing the information for promotion through a ticketing system, through a standard process, to make sure that we have various items that are included in the first iteration of the promotion to say, here's everything you need, rather than, here's the URL. Oh, and then here's the abstract. Oh, you need an image as well. Here's the image. Oh, and yeah, we did want to change the speaker image. So we can change that later. And those things take up time, and that will go against being able to scale. So having a process on how that is done right the first time round is very, very important as we look at scale. And then the execution of the webinar itself. And this comes back to both sustainability as well as the consistency that we spoke about in previous sessions, where the execution of your webinar has to be consistent, predominantly for your audience, so that the experience is the same. It becomes recognizable. It's something that represents your brand correctly, not just in terms of branding, but actually how you speak, how you deliver it, how you portray your webinars. But it also covers the execution of the actual the production of the webinars themselves as well. If every single time you don't follow a process and you do things the way you just remember it, or the way you think is right, or maybe how a new team member might think it's correct, that will impact the webinar quality, but also your abilities to scale up across different divisions. And then the follow-up. After the webinar is done, you can't just stop. But again, it often is forgotten about, and often it maybe involved different teams for the follow-up. And it's important to lay out what is the process, what are we going to follow up with, which additional information, how are we going to do it, when are we going to do it, who's responsible, what are the timelines. So it's easy after webinar, as soon as you hit the sort of 48, 72 hour mark, people may have forgotten about that they attend so much, they watch so much online. So it does need to be efficient so that you can follow up straight away. You capture still the imagination of those who attended, and you can only do that if you have a process in place. Otherwise, you miss that window of opportunity. And then reporting and analysis. So if you run a webinar, or certainly webinars at scale, you will want to report on that because you have a lot of stakeholders, a lot more than you used to. And you need to get some analysis in order to get some insight. So what are the trends? What have we seen? What has worked? What hasn't worked, more importantly? How can we adjust that? And again, querying that data follows a process in order to get it consistently well and on time, so that you actually gather some insight from that. And again, without that, yes, you can run webinars at scale, but whether they will be successful and continue to be successful is another question. And then we have the evaluation and improvement. So that comes from the analysis and the insight. So, learning from what has gone wrong, looking at the process, and this is what I mentioned at the start, you may have to do this over time, multiple times again, looking at what has actually happened and how has this worked. Where has it gone wrong? Why has it gone wrong? Why do we consistently see process step 10 fail or be delayed? And that analysis and insight will help you with this continuous improvement. And again, all of those will help you make things more efficient, maybe cut out some process steps, maybe add some in that were required, maybe automate some of the steps that we talked about before in order to make, take out the human error or certain lack of oversight perhaps of a certain step, and make sure that works well and is continuously improved. And there are certain tools available. Here are just three. We've got Trello, Asana, Wrike, those kind of tools. Consider using those because they will help you with a whole range of points that we've made here. One is in terms of documenting it and visualizing it, making it more user-friendly. So it's not just an Excel sheet. It's not just a Word document that people work against, but actually there is a tool that breaks down your big process into the smaller categories of the process, and within that, the smaller steps, and within that, checklists, but in a way that you have, a visual task board, a Kanban board type scenario, where you have, campaign intake, request forms, things like that you can build on these tools that ultimately will allow you not just to document the process, but actually help you make it work and help it work consistently, and ultimately then feed into that success at scale. Okay, so that's core foundation number one. Core foundation number two is buy-in. And as we're thinking big here, we're thinking hundreds and thousands of webinars. As you look at that, you need buy-in from a lot more people than perhaps before, where, if you run a webinar a month, it's probably your team and the email team needs to be on board to promote it. But really, as you scale beyond that, there will be many more contributors. There will be executives sitting, VPs and directors above these contributors who will have an opinion as to whether their team should be contributing this in the first place. What is the value of this? Why should my team spend time in helping you if there's no value behind this? So you do have to have this buy-in. And the webinars at scale rely on many things, but three things I want to highlight here. One is the consistency that we keep talking about. Without consistency, there's no scale. You will end up doing things differently all the time. You will end up at some point either working all hours of the day, or eventually you just hit a plateau and you just can't go beyond that because it's not consistent enough to deliver it consistently well. And then there has to be recognition of the webinars and webinars at scale as well, internally as well as externally. So if we talk internally, there has to be the recognition that this adds value to the company, be it through, we saw a poll earlier in one of the sessions, why are you running webinars? A lot of you mentioned lead generation. So what is the pipeline contribution? What is the pipeline influence? Is this valuable enough to support? And do we recognize that as something that should be supported and bought into? And externally as well, is there recognition for your webinar program by your audience? If your audience doesn't recognize it as something valuable, why would you scale it? Because you're just going to spend time and nobody's going to attend. So you need to get that in place as well and make sure that that is actually there in the first place. And then the contributors, and I mentioned this before, there will be many, many contributors internally in terms of making sure the webinar has the right content, has the right speakers, has a moderator, adheres to the timelines that you have planned for, but externally as well. There may be external speakers, other contributors that will help you scale up because you may not be able to accomplish everything with your own speakers. So all of this relies on buy-in, and my recommendation would be, in terms of buy-in, not start from the bottom up but top down, and aim high. If you're thinking big, you may as well aim high. So look at the C-level and communicate the value of this program, why at scale it'd be even more valuable than it is already. And engage, for example, the CMO and say, I'd like to show you what this can achieve, what it has already achieved, and what is our projection and prediction of what else it can achieve if we scale this up. We've done it in one division. If we now do it in 5 divisions and in 6 different languages, what could that mean for the pipeline? What have we achieved that we can replicate again? And get that buy-in from the very top. And then that can cascade down. If you have the buy-in from the CMO, it'd be very hard to argue with, to say, well, I don't really support that. Well, our marketing leader supports it, so why wouldn't you? This is valuable to the company. So start at the top down. If you can't get into the C-level, that may very well be the case. Start at VP level. Try and start as high up as you can. And then the buy-in actually relies on the belief in 3 other things. One is your vision. So you need to define, you need to have a vision for this webinars at scale. It's not just a case of, well, we want to run more webinars. Why? Well, what is the vision behind this? What will you achieve, and how will you achieve it? What will this look like? And you need to be able to describe that succinctly. You need to be able to tell the story as to why the company should invest in this, potentially bring in more resources, potentially invest in technology. And that vision has to be very clear and has to be very engaging. And it has to be relevant as well. If it is not relevant to either the company or the apologies, or the audience, then simply there's no reason to scale up. And then you have the success. There has to be a belief that this will succeed. And this comes down to your vision, but it also comes down to results that you've achieved before, to say, well, whoever needs to buy in, whoever you'd like to buy in, needs to believe that this can succeed. And you need to have the right arguments behind that. So get the buy-in. Without buy-in, it becomes incredibly difficult to scale up. And then the third core foundation is to optimize for scale. And we have a couple of different items here that we'll go through, but we'll start with the standardization and documentation. And we spoke about this before, but ultimately, this is the kind of the instructional side of what you want to consider and how you want to go about it in order to optimize for scale. You need to create standard requirements for each process step. So out of your 70, 80, 100 process steps, there has to be standard requirements. What is required for this process step? What do we need? Why is this here? And then you look at the creating a standard method for each process step. How are we going to achieve this process step? How can it be fulfilled? Who is required for it? What is requirement number one that we had in the first point? And lay out the method around that. And then we start looking at creating a scope for each of these process steps. So, combining the first 2 points into what is the scope for us to achieve this, so that then ultimately we can work against that process step and ultimately then the overall process. And all of this will not work if you don't have a time frame against each of the process steps. Typically, you're probably working against a 6 or 8 week lead time for each webinar. That multiplied by 100 or more means that you will, at any given day, be working on, 10, 20, 50 webinars in different stages of their maturity in terms of the setup and the planning. So what you'll need to do is put a time frame against each of the steps and say, the slide deck is due in a week's time. The speaker photos are, due in 2 days' time. Whatever the process step is, the promotion, the setup, all of that has to be documented in a way that you have a time frame against it, so that you can work against that and that becomes accountable. And then we have overall, as we said before a couple of times, you need to document all of this, and the best way to do that is to use your project management tools. We spoke about automation before, and ultimately, if you want to automate, you will need to automate. You need to first consolidate. You need to see what is the overall process. You need to have a vision of what is contained within this in order for you to identify what are the steps that can be automated and that should be automated. And like I said before, you'll want to start with the most labor intensive, but the easiest to automate process steps. But without a clear vision of that, you won't be able to do that properly, or at least you'll be very inefficient in it. And then automate what you can, for example, by using specialist solutions for that. I mentioned it before, there's automation software, there is APIs that exist, and if you don't know how to work with it, then work with somebody, bring in somebody externally, internally. There might be some developers that you have access to be able to automate some of these steps, and that will save significant amounts of time, which will ultimately help you on your scaling effort as well. But automate sensibly. It's not just a priority order of what you're automating, but it's actually also what can be automated, and don't over-automate. Automating a process step that takes 5 minutes to do makes no sense. Automating a process step that would take somebody 4 hours to do makes a lot of sense. So think about, where do you start? Don't over-automate everything. Not everything will be able to be automated. So think about how you approach that point as well. And then be agile. Ultimately, break down the process steps into smaller tasks, as we said before, and then deliver those process stages in sprints. If you haven't done that before, there's plenty of information out there in terms of agile marketing and working in sprints and using visual task boards and Kanban boards. But ultimately, break this down into manageable chunks, so you don't stand in front of a big mountain of steps and you don't know how to do them or when to do them, but actually go through this methodically in 1 or 2 weekly sprints, and approach it that way. And then adjust and improve as and when needed. So don't shy away from improving things just because they're now working finally. You will still need to adjust it. There will always be a requirement to make things better, to adjust things that don't work. And you'll probably find out a few of those over time, maybe only after a year after you analyze everything. But there will be things as you go through the process that you recognize, this is not working. But we now, if we adjust it now, then it will continue working better. And then maybe it takes another few iterations to really work very well. But these things will become clear as you work more and more within that. So keep an eye on that and do that continuous improvement, which is the next point. Continuous improvement, always look for these areas. They, like I said, the more you work within it, the more they will become apparent, because it's the ones that take you a lot of time, or maybe the ones that always fail, or periodically that may have an impact on individual webinars and therefore on the overall performance of the program, and therefore in your effort to scale. And then don't be afraid to change it. The core behind this is, I suppose, it's the consistency again. If you are consistently executing against the process and you then change a small item that didn't work, because everything else remains consistent, you will then be able to see, has this worked? Has this solution improved the way we do things? If you either change too many things at the same time, you won't be able to see which of the changes has affected us positively and which has affected us negatively. But also, it simply just allows you to see very clearly what was the actual real impact in terms of time or efficiency that this one small change has made. And then as part of your agile approach, you can continue making small changes and improving your overall delivery. And that ultimately leads us to having this continuous improvement mindset. And that has to be within your entire team. There has to be a mindset of, it is okay to continuously improve. We have to continuously improve. If we don't continuously improve, we will not be able to scale, achieve the vision that we've set out, and we simply just won't succeed the way we would if we continuously looked at, why is this not working? I'm not just going to put up with it. I'm just going to try and understand, either report it up or make the change myself, depending on your position, and just have that mindset that if you can improve it, do improve it. And then planning ahead. The timescales on these are, guidelines, and it may vary for your company, but they are important to follow as a principle, and depends on what the timelines are for you. But this is what we would recommend for your vision. Have a 2 to 3 year vision for your webinars at scale. We're not talking about what's your vision for an individual program. That may change, but your overall webinars at scale, what are you trying to achieve? Where do you want to be in 2 or 3 years' time with this program? How many divisions should it include? How many webinars do you want to run? How efficient do you want the process to be? What should be the output? What will be the results and the contribution to pipeline, for example? What is that vision? And that should be something that doesn't change quarter on quarter, year on year. It has to be a longer period of time. And then as we go down from that, we look at the strategy behind it. And that can be a 12 to 24 month strategy. So how are we going to achieve that vision? And what are we going to put in place to be able to do it? Be it extending the team, bringing in new technology to help us do it. And how are we laying out the strategy against that? And that's something that you should be looking 12 to 24 months ahead on. And then in terms of innovation, there is plenty to innovate at any given time. There are so many aspects of your webinar program, the individual process steps that can be innovated and improved, be it new webinar formats, be it the way you deliver the webinars, be it the way you plan them, your reporting and analysis. What can you innovate? And you'll really want to be looking at, what can we do? Because this innovation may take time. How can we innovate something in the next 6 months and achieve that in the next half year, maybe up to a year? And how can that innovation roadmap be defined and laid out so that you continuously are able to sustain that? And then you obviously have the program schedule itself. That's where we're looking at 1 to 2 quarters ahead, where you're looking at, what is the schedule, what is the plan for the webinars that we're running, especially as you scale into these larger numbers. You need to have a longer runway of that. Again, with a smaller program, it's easy to be ad hoc and decide on the spot. But really for these webinar programs at scale, you'll want to have that longer runway and that vision of what is the schedule. There's only so much you can schedule ahead based on speaker availability, overall corporate messaging and so on. But a 3 to 6 month time frame is appropriate. Okay, so that is really all of that. I did have earlier in one of the earlier sessions a question on the chat about the webinar excellence manifesto and what is the URL. So I've put that here again, but ultimately what we've defined is 82 principles for webinar excellence, and this covers, as you can see here, the vision, processes, integration, automation, testing, planning, setup, execution, reporting, and innovation. And we've broken that down into 82 principles, freely available. We're giving it away. We're not asking you to register, but check that out, and that will help you strive to excel in all of those.
82. That's impressive. That's very impressive. So we do have some questions for you. I'll combine a couple of questions for those that are in the audience. Yeah, there's some questions about like how do you get buy-in of webinars, but there's also questions about who do you see predominantly as the owners of webinars within the company structure? And I'm guessing the two of those can kind of play into each other. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that ownership. I'm guessing, based on my experience, it seems to be evolving over the last 4 months on the ownership of it, but that ownership and then buy-in, how do you look at that?
So it depends on the purpose of the webinar. If we're assuming it's a marketing and lead generation webinar program, it will sit within marketing typically. Probably with a strong buy-in from sales, product, and probably a few other divisions that will contribute to that. But the actual ownership still sits within marketing. There may be a performance team that may own that, but ultimately marketing will feed that together with the product team. So typically that's where we see it still sitting now, with a strong interest from the sales and the commercial team. In terms of buy-in, it depends a lot on your leadership. We've worked with customers where the CMO proactively said, who's running marketing, who's running webinars? We need to run webinars. I don't want to hear anything else. We're running webinars. And that came from the CMO proactively, no further buy-in required. There's other organizations where the commercial teams are saying, we've had great experience with webinars in other companies, but we need to bring other folks on board for this. So it is very individual, but if you have a good case to make and you can show results already, and you can extrapolate that out to say, well, if we did more of this, we need more investment, but we also have higher results. That's a fairly easy case to make, and it may take a few quarters if there's other budget requirements, for example. But ultimately, from a principal buy-in, that should help you a lot to get that buy-in in the first place.
I'm curious, I couldn't agree more with your focus on consistency, right? And for a lot of marketing and sales teams, they already have a lot of content marketing going out, blog posts, email newsletters, video, because everyone's doing video. What role in the consistency of a webinar should the rest of your content marketing plan play? If you're already inundating people with a couple, an email a week and a couple blog posts a week, what role should that content play with webinars? Or is that something that, if the webinar is good enough and the audience is segmented, it shouldn't impact it? How do you kind of play those two worlds?
Yeah, there's only so many emails you can send before you end up with this very, very small segment or people being spammed. So you need to become a bit smarter around how you dissect that out. So you have your core email programs to do the mass promotion. And what we often see is, in terms of priority, live events and webinars, live events at the moment not so much, take priority in terms of promotion because they have a finite live day and that's when it happens. So in terms of the email governance, that takes priority over other promotions. But you're quite right, there are other content items and they need to be put out there as well. But there are different ways of doing that, be it consolidated in newsletters, for example, be it as part of an active community where it gets promoted, obviously on social media, paid or organic. But as you scale, you need to find smarter ways of getting the message out that these are there. A prominent webinar portal on the website will help a lot, especially if it's SEO optimized for people to find that proactively on an inbound way as well. But you're right, there is a lot to compete with. What we do see is, because of effectively webinars are the only marketing tactic worth gating that since the invention of the internet. Everything else, if you think about white papers, reports, Everything else existed before the internet, but with webinars, you have this high level of interactivity where you get behavioral data, you get demographic data, you get insights that you can't get from anywhere else. Once somebody's downloaded a white paper, how many lines did they read? How long did they, how often did they go back to it? So it should take priority in our opinion, because you get that high level of insight. But you need to, that's what I mean with the integration into the other marketing ecosystem elements. It needs to live with everything else in harmony as well. It just can't take over.
I'm curious, I like that answer too. And I'm curious from a standpoint, I'm doing a lot in the virtual event space. So multi-hour, multi-day events. And one of my bold predictions is that I believe the mobile apps, mobile focused, technology is going to have a massive impact on the success of these longer virtual events, because we have to figure out a way to connect with somebody when they're not in front of their screen, but they're not at our physical conference. I'm curious on mobile innovation in the webinar space, as far as push notifications, as far as community engagement, before, during, and after webinar. How do you see mobile? We've always lived in this mobile first world, but I kind of feel like in the webinar space, mobile hasn't been fully integrated in that compartment. How do you see that kind of shifting now? Or maybe I'm thinking too far into it.
No. It's I think what we won't see is a huge proportion of people watching webinars on their mobile. We still now, probably 4 or 5 years in, are seeing a very small percentage of folks consuming webinars on their mobile live. What we are seeing more trends on is the engagement with the company or the content through mobile in parallel to your main screen. So if we're looking at, let's say you're attending a full day event like this one, and you may stay for the full duration. You may not be able to because you have other meetings, but you still have a second device. You have this small screen that you have in your hand on your desk all the time, and within there you have the ability to maybe network much better than on an individual webinar where it's the frame and it's maybe hard to see everybody who's there. But take the second screen. On top of that, you then have applications where you can begin to network as part of the bigger event, where you're much more natively happy to scroll around and spend time on than the big screen where you also have your Slack and your Outlook and your presentations that you need to work on and everything else. But you always have the second screen there that you will be able to utilize. So that's where we see more interactivity happening. And I think overall, if you can make that work with the third-party tools as well that integrate with your webinar platform, you will see an uplift that you wouldn't have had otherwise if you hadn't used that second small screen.
I love that. I presented at an event, the Drift conference, and their survey went out that 81% of people were watching their conference on a mobile device. And I spoke at one 2 weeks ago, and it was somewhere north of 70%. But this was much more, I would say it was less webinar as far as active data participation, much more conference focused. But to your point, found lots of interaction as far as community, people sharing, even connecting audience members with audience members. I think when we look in this virtual arena, one of the things that I always loved with live streaming, Facebook Live, LinkedIn Live, is if you can be the facilitator of connecting people, it also can add value as far as business and long-term value down the road as well. So I mean, this was great information, great insights. You gave us 3 full in-depth strategy sessions. So I commend you, my friend. I enjoyed all 3 of them. I thought they had some really unique points. You have a guide with 82 different elements as well. So hopefully everyone is getting as much value as I was out of that. And I think with that, we're going to switch up our agenda just a little bit. And I'm going to kick it back over to Stina and see what's going on over there at the Hub.